All right. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Sandy Barr, the director for Sierra Club's Grand Canyon chapter. That's the Arizona chapter. Welcome to tonight's webinar. We are going to learn about groundwater and the Arizona Groundwater Management Act. And our speaker this evening is Natalie Mass. Natalie is the Active Management Areas Director for the Arizona Department of Water Resources. And please join me in welcoming her. You can use your virtual clapping. And then with that, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Natalie.
All right. Well, thanks, Sandy, and thank you all of you for having me tonight. I'm gonna fumble around here for just a moment so I can share my screen. So apologies for my lack of practice with Zoom. I'm used to a different platform, but we'll fumble through it. My name is Natalie Mast. I'm the Active Management Areas Director at the Arizona Department of Water Resources. So my team here at ADWR is responsible for administering all of the details of the regulations associated with active management areas and irrigation non-expansion areas, and implementing the conservation requirements, the mandatory conservation programs in those active management areas. And I'll talk more about what all of that means as we work through this presentation. I am going to cover a lot of ground today. I know we're leaving time at the end for any questions, but I am going to kind of run through things really quickly. What I'm hoping is that this will provide a little bit of a foundation for you all to better understand the structures that we have for groundwater management in Arizona, how Arizona's managed groundwater in the past, how things have changed over time, and how we are planning for and working toward the future at ADWR. So if you have any trouble hearing me or seeing my screen, please let me know, but I'm gonna just jump right in. Oops, oh dear, there we go. Okay. So, Groundwater Management Act. The Groundwater Management Act was a piece of legislation that was passed in 1980. The 1980 Groundwater Management Act was passed to address severe groundwater depletion in some parts of the state, and due to some political pressures related to funding for the Central Arizona Project infrastructure. What you can see on the screen is a little bit of an additive structure that the Act created. So the way the Act is structured is that you have some regulations that apply statewide. You have some, in addition to those statewide regulations that apply in the irrigation non-expansion areas. And then you have additional regulations that apply in the active management areas. So starting statewide, across the entire state of Arizona, you are required to register a well and give notice to the department before you drill a new well or modify an existing well. There are also adequate water supply requirements that I'll talk about a little bit later in more detail, and requirements around community water systems. So the community water systems is mandatory reporting and some planning activities for municipal water providers across the state. In addition, again, so additive structure. So when you get to an INA, all of those statewide requirements apply, plus an INA is an irrigation non-expansion area. So all of those statewide requirements plus the expansion of irrigated acres is prohibited. So from when that INA was created, you cannot irrigate additional acres of land. There is also mandatory measuring and annual reporting of water use in irrigation non-expansion areas. Then active management areas add another layer to that. So in an INA, or excuse me, in an AMA, you have all of those statewide requirements, you have all of those INA requirements, and we build on that. We convert adequate water supply to a more stringent assured water supply. Again, I'll cover that in more detail later. And you also have things like groundwater rights and withdrawal permits, so more volumetric requirements. You have management goals and management plans and conservation requirements. I'll talk about those a little bit more in detail a little bit later too. You also have incentives for things like recharge and recovery of renewable water supplies. And you have specific structures for the creation of additional active management areas and irrigation non-expansion areas. So our initial irrigation non-expansion areas and active management areas, we had a set of INAs and AMAs that were created by that 1980 Groundwater Management Act. So what you can see on the screen is a map from 1984. So it was actually a little bit after that 1980 Act. The initial active management areas were Prescott, Phoenix, Pinal, and Tucson. And the initial INAs were Joseph City and the Douglas INA. Harquahala INA is also on this map, but Harquahala was actually a subsequent INA. It was our first subsequent INA, and it was established by order of the director in 1981. And I'll talk a little bit more later about what that means. So what you can see here is that this is where we started in 1980, and I'll show an updated map like this a little bit later that shows where we are now. So we started out with 4 AMAs and 2 INAs. The statutory structures around active management areas provide for management goals, management plans, and conservation programs. And this is something that can get a little bit jumbled for folks. So I've found it helpful to think about these as kind of as distinct, but also connected to each other. So each active management area has a management goal. And that management goal is a big overarching kind of target for the AMA to work toward over time, over subsequent management plans and over subsequent practices. So big overarching target is your management goal. And that management goal informs how we develop our management plans. In an active management area, the management plan is our main regulatory document. So these management plans have a lot of background information, but the real kind of meat of those management plans is the regulatory conservation requirements that, moving on to kind of the next piece there, those conservation programs that are contained in the management plans are mandated by statute to be designed to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. So when you're thinking about a groundwater management goal, any groundwater management goal that we've at least come up with to date can be contributed to by reducing withdrawals of groundwater. So you think about your management goal, the management plan is the specific strategies and policies that are informed by that management goal. And the conservation programs are the tool by which we reduce withdrawals of groundwater in order to move toward that management goal.
Okay.
The initial AMAs had their management goals laid out in statute as a part of the Groundwater Management Act. So I mentioned on an earlier slide that our initial AMAs were Prescott, Phoenix, Tucson, and Pinal. I have Santa Cruz on this slide, and I'll explain that in a moment. For Prescott, Phoenix, Tucson, and Santa Cruz, the goal for those active management areas is basically safe yield. So safe yield is a groundwater management goal which attempts to achieve a long-term balance between groundwater that's going into the aquifer and groundwater that's going out of the aquifer. Safe yield is more complicated than it sounds because of that annual thing balanced with that long-term thing, balanced with that thereafter achieve thing, or sorry, thereafter maintain, excuse me, thing. Because it's not just we're going to reach safe yield, we're also going to thereafter maintain safe yield. In addition, safe yield is more complicated than it sounds because in our active management areas, we have stored water that is underground. So we can't just look at all of the water that is underground and think about that as groundwater, because we have other types of water that are also stored underground. So safe yield is really a groundwater focused metric, and we have to kind of think about it in both that legal sense of what the types of water are and that kind of physical sense in order to get a really good picture of it. The Pinal AMA does have a different statutory goal, which is kind of two-sided, which is to allow development of non-irrigation uses and also preserve agricultural economies for as long as feasible. The Santa Cruz AMA has its goal a little bit different than Phoenix, Tucson, and Prescott, in that it's safe yield with an added component, where it's safe yield plus preventing local water table declines. The reason that I didn't include Santa Cruz as a part of my list of the on the initial slide is because it was actually split out from the Tucson AMA in the mid-90s. The footprint of the AMAs didn't change at that point, so the Santa Cruz AMA, that area that is now the Santa Cruz AMA, became an AMA in 1980 with the establishment of the Groundwater Management Act, but at that point it was just a part of the Tucson AMA, and it was split out later kind of in recognition of some of the really unique hydrology there, and also in recognition of the really unique international water issues related to the Santa Cruz AMA. So statutory management plans. So for those initial active management areas, so now we're counting initial, Santa Cruz is considered as initial, so it's those 5 initial AMAs, Prescott, Phoenix, Pinal, Tucson, Santa Cruz. For those initial AMAs, the statutes laid out a series of 5 a series of 5 management plans. Those management plans, again, like I pointed to earlier, contain the mandatory conservation program. So these are regulatory conservation programs designed to achieve reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. That series is really important. This is where we get increasing conservation over time. So that design of the series of management plans is really designed to incrementally increase those conservation requirements over time to keep the AMA slowly over time moving toward its management goal. Assured water supply is another component of that Groundwater Management Act and active management areas. This is something that is complicated and I know is confusing for a lot of people. I know it was confusing for me for a really long time, and in a lot of ways still is. But I've found this particular slide to be really helpful in kind of understanding the differences of the different kind of forms of assured and adequate water supply that we see across the state. So similar to the way that I talked about the Groundwater Management Act being additive, related to requirements statewide and then in INAs and then in AMAs. The Assured and Adequate Water Supply Program we can kind of think about as additive also. It's just not additive quite in that same way. So adequate water supply applies statewide. There are requirements for adequate water supply, which are physical, legal, and continuous availability of that water for 100 years, financial capability of the provider to deliver that water, and that that water is of sufficient quality for the purpose it'll be used for. So adequate water supply applies outside of the AMAs. The important thing is that your typical adequate water supply outside the active management areas is a notification step. So this is a requirement that the subdivider, so if you subdivide lands, that you obtain a water report, and that water report has to be provided to the first buyer of that subdivided lot. And that water report can indicate, yes, there is adequate water supply, or no, there is not adequate water supply. So adequate water supply statewide is really a notification step. It's not a permitting step. It doesn't prohibit a lot with inadequate water supply from being sold, but it does notify that buyer. Mandatory adequacy takes it a little bit of a step further. So outside of active management areas, local governments can opt into what we call mandatory adequacy. So we have a few jurisdictions that have done this. It's Cochise and Yuma counties, and the towns of Clarkdale and Patagonia have opted into what we refer to as mandatory adequacy. And that takes that notification step that was under adequate water supply, and it turns it into a permitting step. So now you have to get a water report, and that water report has to indicate, yes, there is adequate water supply in order to be able to get your plat for that development, for that subdivision. So the adequate water supply is notification, mandatory adequacy turns that into a requirement, a permitting step. Similarly, assured water supply inside the AMAs is a permitting step. With assured water supply, some of the criteria by which we analyze these different requirements changes. So the requirements around physical, legal, continuous availability might be a little more stringent. Same with financial and financial capability and quality. Those requirements might be a little bit different or more stringent inside the active management areas, how we apply them inside the AMAs, but they still all apply. You have to check all of those boxes to get a determination of assured water supply. In addition, assured water supply has 2 additional requirements that we have to consider. So assured water supply also requires that new subdivisions be consistent with the management plan for that active management area, and that that new development be consistent with the management area. So in order to get a determination of assured water supply in an active management area, you have to check all of those boxes. Again, it's a permitting step. So if you can't check all of those boxes, then you're not able to get that determination of assured water supply. All right, I know I'm running through this quickly, but there's a lot of information here. And hopefully we'll be able to answer a few of your questions at the end. All of the things I've talked about so far were established in some form in the 1980s. This is really significant. This is something we should note and celebrate. That Groundwater Management Act was genuinely ahead of its time in many ways. And also, things have changed very substantially since then. And we're seeing a lot of different types of challenges now that we might not have anticipated as that act was being developed. So I promised I would show an updated map. Here's our updated map of the current, as of today, existing active management areas and irrigation non-expansion areas. So we started with Prescott, Phoenix, Pinal, Tucson, and Santa Cruz considered initial. The Douglas AMA was added to that list of active management areas in December of 2022. So just a little over a year ago now. The Douglas INA is superseded by the AMA, so the INA is no more. The Joseph City INA is one of our initial ones. Harquahala, I mentioned, was created by order of the director in 1981. And the Wallapai Valley INA is our first INA since the 1980s. And that was also established in December of 2022. So in the last little bit over a year, we've had our first actual changes to this map since the 1980s. And that's really substantial. There's a lot happening with this right now. So methods to establish a new AMA or INA. I mentioned before that the 1980 Groundwater Management Act established methods to create new AMAs and INAs, and that's what you can see here. The processes to establish a new AMA or INA can vary in their details a little bit, but at their core, each has a process to establish a newly regulated area by either local initiation or by designation of the ADWR director. What we saw in the Wallapai Valley INA most recently was a request from the local governments there that the ADWR director initiate a process to consider the designation of an INA. Ultimately, that process was initiated in 2022. And through a hearing, the director decided to establish an INA in the Wallapai Valley Basin. So that falls into the category kind of in the bottom left here of director designation with the Harquahala INA. This could have theoretically gone through a local initiation process in a similar way with a petition that would result in a hearing and a decision by the ADWR director. For AMAs, the director can also initiate those proceedings and that consideration. But what we saw recently in Douglas and Wilcox was local initiation. So the process for local initiation for an AMA, though, is a little bit different than an INA in an important way, where the result of a petition with an INA is an ADWR hearing and a decision by the director. The result of a petition for an AMA is an election that gets called by the county or counties where the basin lies. So petitions were submitted in 2022 to Graham and Cochise counties. And with the results of that November election, the Wilcox Basin did not become an AMA, and the Douglas Basin did. So as of December 1st, 2022, we have the Douglas AMA that ends up superseding the INA. So what does it mean to establish a new INA or a new AMA? INA establishment has a few provisions to it. If you remember that kind of additive chart at the beginning, we're thinking about our statewide provisions and we're just adding a few things to it, right? So with the establishment of an INA, we begin more closely monitoring historically irrigated acreage in that area to determine compliance with that irrigation non-expansion provision. Those who are irrigating 2 or more acres must apply for an irrigation authority to document what those legally irrigable acres are. And those using water from a non-exempt well must measure and annually report their water use. So that definition for non-exempt well, I don't think I have that in this presentation, but a non-exempt well meets 3 criteria. It's 35 gallons per minute or less of pump capacity. It is using less than 10 acre feet for a non-irrigation type of use, and it's not irrigating 2 or more acres of crops for sale or consumption. So as long as it meets all 3 of those criteria, then it can be considered exempt. And an exempt well is exempt from the measuring and reporting requirements that exist in an AMA or an INA. So those who have to measure and report are those who are using water from non-exempt wells. Annual reports are required to be submitted to ADWR each year. And so folks in the new Wallapai Valley Basin will be required to submit those annual reports in March of this year. For subsequent AMAs, this establishment process is a lot more complicated. You can see that there are obviously a lot more things on this list, and also this is not even a comprehensive list. In addition to the irrigation non-expansion provisions and measuring and reporting, there are a whole series of additional requirements that either go into place immediately or that must be developed over kind of that creation period of the active management area. And we estimate that the kind of bare minimum timeline for creating all of those structures for an active management area and having everything effective is probably around 5 years. So it is not a quick or short process. For those items that must be developed, there is opportunity for customization with a management goal that recognizes the unique circumstances for a given area and a management plan and conservation requirements that work toward that management goal. We have other regulatory requirements as well. There is local advice built into this structure with both public meetings that ADWR has traditionally held and with statutory requirements related to groundwater users advisory councils in the local areas and with public hearings for the adoption of management goals, management plans, and assured water supply rules. But there are also items that by statute are not customizable in an active management area, like grandfathered rights and well permitting requirements. A new AMA is not a magic bullet though, and existing water uses through those grandfathered rights will largely be grandfathered in. Those who have been irrigating or using water for non-irrigation uses prior to the establishment of an AMA may largely continue to do so, subject to conservation requirements, but they can largely continue to do so as long as they apply for a grandfathered right by the deadline. So that's something that's really important to understand about a subsequent AMA or any AMA, is that a lot of these things do get carried forward. Something I'll note before I move on from this slide is withdrawal fees is crossed out here. We do have withdrawal fees in each of our initial active management areas, but withdrawal fees are not authorized right now in the existing statutes for subsequent AMAs. And the reason for that is that the structure for withdrawal fees was laid out on an AMA by AMA basis. So each of the 5 initial AMAs has its own individual structure for how those withdrawal fees can be established and collected. And those statutes did not contemplate subsequent AMAs. So we don't have that structure or authorization in the statutes for subsequent AMAs to levy withdrawal fees. A subsequent AMA does have a management goal, but unlike the initial AMAs, where these were established by statute, so we talked about Safefield, we talked about the Pinal AMA goal, those were all established by statute through the Groundwater Management Act or other amendments. For a subsequent AMA, the management goal is established through ADWR proceedings. ADWR, in the creation of the Douglas management goal, that is still under ongoing review and development, ADWR did seek to echo some of the statutory goals for the initial AMAs, and we also considered extensive local feedback in that process. This goal is still being finalized. It's still tentative and is currently undergoing some ongoing judicial review. The management plan timeline for a subsequent AMA. Again, this is a long process. The requirement in statute for a subsequent AMA is that the management plan be adopted within 2 years of the establishment of the active management area. So for Douglas, that deadline is the end of this year, is December 1st of this year of 2024. So after the management goal for Douglas was developed, ADWR began a process to develop an initial management plan for the Douglas AMA. And this is, again, kind of going back to that circle chart. This is really where the tools of an active management area come in, with developing conservation requirements that reduce withdrawals of groundwater. We are able to move an AMA closer to its management goal. These conservation requirements are really a major part of the methods or strategies that make an AMA what it is. It's the sum of these and the other requirements in an AMA that enable us to reduce withdrawals of groundwater and move the AMA toward its goal. The statutes for subsequent AMAs are not as prescriptive as the initial AMAs. So where the initial AMAs had a requirement for 5 management plans over 5 management periods, the statutes for subsequent AMAs just indicate that there may be one or more management plans that follow the series of management plan statutes more generally. Even so, the management plans are really a significant opportunity for customization. And these are a really important defining document for how an AMA is structured and what types of tools we have to move that AMA to its goal. All right. An AMA also includes requirements for folks to obtain authorities for groundwater use. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because it's not that type of presentation and I could spend a whole hour just on these rights. But I did want to take an opportunity to point out this deadline for the Douglas AMA. So by statute, anyone in a subsequent AMA, folks must apply for a grandfathered right within 15 months of the establishment of the AMA. So the establishment of the AMA for Douglas was December 1st, 2022. 15 months after that is March 1st, 2024. So that deadline is a very hard deadline. ADWR does not have authority to be flexible on this deadline, and there are no exceptions. So anyone claiming a right to use groundwater in the Douglas AMA, either to irrigate 2 or more acres of land or to use 10 or more acre feet for a non-irrigation use, they must apply for a grandfathered right by March 1st. No exceptions, and anyone who does not apply by that deadline is by statute deemed to have waived and relinquished their right to use groundwater pursuant to a grandfathered right. So this is really important. This is not something that we're able to have any flexibility on. And I would really encourage folks, if you know folks in the Douglas AMA, please do share this deadline as widely as possible. So future. There has obviously been a lot that was developed back in 1980. There's been a lot that has happened since then. And what do we see coming next? How can we take these existing requirements, the things that we've developed over time, and make sure that they're continuing to serve Arizona, serve their purpose for the next 44 years and for the next generations? One forum where we are beginning to have some of those conversations is through the Governor's Water Policy Council. And this is kind of a fun little thing. The Governor Hobbs created the council on January 9th of 2023. So 1 year ago today, this council was created. And she tasked that group with providing recommendations to update, revise, and improve Arizona's water management frameworks. The council had a very aggressive schedule of meetings and a really intense timeline, but they were able to have some very blunt conversations about what our challenges are and how our regulatory structures may need to be adjusted to address some of those challenges. The council, at least so far, has had 2 focus areas: assured water supply and rural water management issues. And so they created 2 committees to address those areas. The Assured Water Supply Committee really was focusing kind of on a broader context of physical availability issues that we're seeing in the Phoenix and Pinal active management areas right now. The Assured Water Supply Committee discussed those issues and considered the challenges that might be facing the program, the Assured Water Supply program, for the future. The committee was tasked with creating recommendations for updates to the Assured Water Supply program, with the guardrails that those recommendations must fit within specific principles laid out for the program. And you can see those principles on the screen. These principles include maintaining the really critical consumer protection intent of the program and the integrity of the program, while still finding paths for future growth without reliance on mined groundwater. So we were looking for our really rational opportunities for where there might be improvements to the program. These weren't things like getting rid of the models or fixing the models. Our models are the best available science. But rather we were looking at really practical, rational ways that the program might be improved and might be made more adaptable to future conditions over time. The Rural Committee, similarly, the Rural Groundwater Committee was tasked with creating recommendations for Rural Groundwater Management Act, including considering whether our existing tools were sufficient to address the challenges that our rural areas are seeing now and that our state can expect to see in some of these rural areas in the future. The council in December finalized a suite of recommendations in these areas, and the details of those recommendations were published in a report that's available on ADWR's website. I'll make sure that Sandy gets a PDF of these slides so this link can be available to you all as well. These recommendations included potential structures to address build to rent and wildcat development loopholes in existing assured water supply regulations, and laid out an alternative pathway to designation for water providers in areas that have physical availability issues. So I mentioned specifically Phoenix and Pinell. On the rural groundwater side, the recommendations included a push for incentives for voluntary reporting and measuring and reporting of water use, and a recommendation for a new regulatory option called a rural groundwater management area, which would provide rural communities with additional opportunities to customize those requirements, those conservation requirements and tools to address the specific needs that they see and the challenges in their communities. These recommendations, I would really emphasize that this was done on a really short timeline. These recommendations are significant and innovative in their content and in their potential to move the state forward into the future. They're also significant in terms of the deep engagement and collaboration that they represent across some of the typical parochial interests that you see in water. Finally, and I'm getting close to the end, so we'll leave plenty of time for questions. Finally, how we do all of this work is really important. Both in terms of managing existing structures and requirements, and how we approach developing those future structures and requirements. ADWR tracks and manages and maintains a very extensive and broad range of data. With our field services group, we collect extensive data regarding well levels and depth to water, monitoring changes in water levels and physical phenomena like subsidence. In planning and permitting, we also manage extensive data sets based on permitting activities and annual reports, but that data is still limited or non-existent outside the active management areas and INAs where that reporting is mandated. Our groundwater models take into account both physical water level measurements and water use information that we have available. But outside of those areas with reported water use, we often end up relying on various types of water use estimates. And those estimates can have really widely varying degrees of accuracy. However, with funding and a mandate from a piece of 2022 legislation that expanded WIFA, ADWR is working to expand its data analysis and projection activities. Over the last year and a half, ADWR has built a team and built strategies for approaching this analysis, and this is something we're really proud of and excited about. This is a water supply and demand assessment for each groundwater basin in the state. We published our first set of basin reports on ADWR's website on December 1st, And we're working toward analyzing every groundwater basin in the state at least once every 5 years. So in purple on this map on the screen, those are the basins that were published this past December. The basins in blue are also listed on our website. Those are the basins that we'll be analyzing this upcoming year for our 2024 round of reports. So we expect to publish those on December 1st of this year. By the end of 2027, by December of 2027, we will have made projections for water demands and water supplies in each groundwater basin in the state, allowing us to more clearly articulate our water issues and needs as a state and allowing for some prioritization in addressing any identified shortfalls. The really unique thing about this analysis as compared to previous analyses is that this is recurring. So there were a number of previous analyses that looked at water supplies and demands around the state, but they often were one-off reports. A report would be done, an analysis would be done, and then that would go on the shelf, and that was kind of the end of it. With this, the design is recurring. So once we get to 2027 and publish all of our reports, we'll start back at the beginning and work through updating each of those reports so that we have an ongoing source of analysis and information on all of these basins statewide going forward into the future. I'm going to close with a couple quotes. The first one is not on the screen, but it's a quote from Mary Daly, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco. I'm a big data nerd, so this is something that really spoke to me. She said, "The data aren't the answers. They're part of the answer, but they aren't the complete picture." And what that tells me is data is so critical for so much of what we do for water management as a state. You can't manage what you don't measure. And at the same time, the data won't always tell us what the solutions are. The data analysis is important, but the data can't write policy for us. So that's where the quote on the screen comes in. We're in an era of very difficult choices. Our predecessors made also very difficult choices, and we're able to move forward and find compromises. And we're now tasked with standing on their shoulders and doing the same. We'll have to make a choice about which aspects of our lifestyle we can give up and which we can maintain. We're having some of those conversations now. We'll need to continue having those moving forward. And we're starting to build the data sets and the background information needed to make good, informed, data-driven policy decisions. Arizona is really creative and resilient. We've been able to do these types of hard negotiations and hard developments of policy over time. And I'm really hopeful and confident that we'll be able to find a way forward that builds on our strong culture of conservation and allows the state to continue to thrive. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Like I said, Sandy, I'll share this with you so you all have my contact information if you have any questions beyond today, but I'm happy to take any questions that might come up now.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Natalie. And if folks can use your reactions to give Natalie a hand, we really appreciate that. That was really informative. I saw some questions in the chat, so why don't we start with those and then we can move to other questions. The first question I saw in the chat, I think is an easy one. Are INA reports published publicly, and are there remediation plans that are issued should a water rights holder be found to be non-compliant?
Sure. So yes, annual reports are published on our website. So if you go to ADWR's main webpage and scroll down to the bottom, on the bottom right-hand side, there's a link that says imaged records. And you can use that imaged records page to search any of our water documents. That's groundwater in active management areas and INAs. That's also surface water documents. That's assured water supply documents. It's very broad. We have all of our water documents available through that website. In terms of remediation plans, those are handled on kind of a case-by-case basis, but often once they get to a stage of agreement on how they're going to move forward, then that would be also available on DocuShare. So our compliance team would work closely with the water user to find a way to bring that person back into compliance. And typically that's documented in a legal document that would be made available online.
Great. And then the next one is for an INA, you can't irrigate more acres, but you can pump more water, right?
Right. So it's a really good point, and it looks like that was Trish Garrett. Thank you for that question. Yes. So an INA it has a prohibition on the expansion of irrigated acres. So we establish those irrigated acres, what those legally irrigable acres are, but there are no volumetric requirements. There is not a volume limitation on a given piece of irrigable land. So it does not prohibit, for example, someone from switching from growing aloe to growing alfalfa. That would be allowed within an irrigation non-expansion area. It's really, the prohibition in an INA is really on that irrigated footprint.
And then Winky Tax is asking, what was the initial water use in the Joseph City INA?
I don't know numbers off of the top of my head, but the Joseph City INA was a little bit unique as compared to the other INAs. In the other INAs, it was really consideration of expansion of irrigated agriculture that was the concern there. For the Joseph City INA, there was a power plant there that they were really wanting to make sure that they were protecting the water supplies for. There was some expansion in the irrigation kind of in close proximity there, but the purpose of the Joseph City INA was really with the intent of preserving that water supply for the power plant there. It's kind of an interesting history there.
Oh. Yeah, for the Choya power plant, yes, which will be closing down next year, or yeah, next year, 2025. I'm not sure if I understand this question, so we might have to have you on mute. What are the types of water underground?
I understand this one.
Oh, okay, okay.
So in an active management area where we are recharging renewable supplies of water, the water that is stored maintains its legal character as the type of water that was stored. So, for example, if we take Colorado River water and recharge that in the Phoenix AMA, that chunk of water that was put underground with that recharge activity stays classified for our accounting purposes as Colorado River water. So even though it's underground, it might not be legally classified as groundwater. So in an active management area, you might have water underground that is surface water or Colorado River water or effluent. It might not necessarily all be legally classified as groundwater. And that's part of what makes that safe yield evaluation a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. How is groundwater use measured?
Good question. So ADWR actually adopted specific rules around measuring devices. So the typical way groundwater use is measured is using a meter. Most meters that we see are a totalizer type meter. If you think about like the water meter that you might have at your house, they tend to be pretty similar to those where it's just a total amount of water. And if you look at it at the beginning of the year and you look at it at the end of the year, then you can subtract the two numbers and report your water use based on that. That is the most typical measurement method that we see. There are other alternatives to that particular method that folks can use, but most commonly it's through that totalizer type meter.
And then Dre says preserve existing ag economies for as long as feasible seems really squishy. What is feasible?
And it's a really good question, and it looks like there might have been a little of additional conversation around that one. It's a really good question, and yes, it is a management goal that is a little bit challenging to analyze because it's a little bit squishy and because you have these two kind of internally competing goals within it. What I can say about the Pinal Active Management Area is that ADWR has stated publicly that the Pinal AMA is not meeting its management goal because they have not, they have these physical availability issues related to assured water supply. And so they are not preserving water supplies for future non-irrigation uses.
Right. And then Wilcox Basin is unique and depends solely on rainwater replenishment. What can be done to protect this unique aquifer from current and future withdrawals?
It's a really good question. And I think that's something that we're going to see as a really challenging issue for places like Wilcox, somewhere like Douglas. So if you really think about overdraft, overdraft at its core is not that far off from a water supply and demand imbalance. If you think about that, if you want to have things in balance, you want your water supplies to be equal to or greater than your water demands, right? In overdraft, your demands are greater than your supplies. And so you have two options in terms of tools there. You can either reduce your demands or you can increase your supplies, or you can kind of do both, right? But in terms of the categories of tools, you really only have those two options. And so when we're talking about places like Wilcox and Douglas, our opportunities for increasing supplies are going to be really limited because, like you said, it's really based on rainwater replenishment. It's mountain front recharge largely in that basin. And your opportunity for increasing that mountain front recharge is going to be a little bit limited. Your opportunity for importing supplies is also going to be a little bit limited. It's going to be different than it was kind of for the assumptions that went into the initial AMAs, where there was this assumption of Colorado River water coming in. It's just going to be different for some of these rural areas where your options on that supply side are really limited. So your real options are on that demand side, and that makes things really challenging in terms of getting closer to a sustainable future in those areas.
Great. The next question is, does ADWR monitor groundwater quality issues such as PFAS in Tucson's water supply and how it impacts what is available to use?
It's a really good question. So ADWR is not responsible for monitoring water quality. But that said, we do take quality into consideration, and we do collaborate closely with the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, ADEQ, on certain permitting issues related to quality. So it's not something that we as an agency have authority to monitor, but we do collaborate closely with the agency that does monitor those quality issues.
Yeah, and I can give people some more info on what ADEQ is doing and also EPA if you need it. Let's see, what does an analysis entail and what data is included? Only doing approximately 6 per year seems inadequate. A lot happens in 5 years.
Yeah, so we have 51 groundwater basins, which is a lot. Our minimum is 6 per year, but we're going to have to average 10 or 11 in order to get through all 51 on a 5-year rotating basis. So because this past year was our first year of the analysis, we started a little bit slow because we had a lot of work to do to figure out how we were going to be doing the analysis, building a lot of structures that we're going to be able to build on and add complexity to over time. We had to make a lot of these kind of baseline decisions in this first year. So we spent a lot of time on those structures. And because of the amount of time we spent on those structures, it allowed less time for and analyzing basins in that first year. So we did 7 basins in our first year in 2023. I believe we have 14 on the agenda for 2024, so we are increasing that rapidly. Something I'll say is that 5 years in water time is not a lot of time. These basins and the hydrology in these areas changes slowly. The other thing I'll say is that previous supply and demand reports have been done on often much longer cycles, 15 or 20 years. And so 5 years is really an improvement, is a really helpful point of reference for us to look at over time. However, it's imperfect because a lot of these areas don't have reported data. We don't necessarily have a point of comparison to know whether our estimates are accurate. We don't have any reported data in these areas, so these estimates are really all we have. And so we're basing a lot of this information on really broad estimates and limited information.
Natalie, is it okay if we go over just a little bit? There's just
Sure.
a few more questions in the
Sure.
chat and then one raised hand. So thank you so much. How do you compare the measurement of field irrigation against watering livestock?
It's a really good question. And this maybe gets a little bit technical. So they're very different methods. So typically for watering livestock, your estimates are going to be based on the type of animal and the number of animals that are present, where irrigation is going to be based on the type of crop, the soil types present, the type of irrigation methods that they're using. So looking at consumptive use and kind of an assumed irrigation efficiency to calculate water use estimates related to the different things. There is a methods appendix that was included with the supply and demand reports that goes into a ton of detail on how those estimates were generated. That's going to be a much better source for some of that information than what I can rattle off the top of my head.
Great, thank you. And then it sounds like there's policy around the development of subdivision, build to rent, and policy to deal with rural and agricultural uses, but does commercial and mixed use developments have similar limitations to protect groundwater?
It kind of depends. And maybe that's something that again gets really far into the weeds. So with assured water supply in an active management area, there are 2 ways that a determination of assured water supply can be obtained. One of those ways is at the subdivision level, where a developer wants to build a subdivision and they obtain what's called a certificate of assured water supply for that subdivision. Or the other one is a designation of assured water supply, and that's at the provider level. So that designation of assured water supply covers all of the uses in that provider's service area. So in that way, if they're receiving water from a designated provider, that commercial and mixed use development might have requirements associated with that designation of assured water supply that's kind of managed by the provider. But if it's a undesignated provider that's serving certificates, those developments would not have regulations associated with assured water supply. They might be subject to conservation requirements under the management plan, but they wouldn't be subject to assured water supply in the same way in that certificate scenario. And that gets wonky real quick.
Thank you so much, Natalie. All right, and Steve, you had a question?
Yeah, it seems like a couple weeks ago on the PBS program Arizona Horizons, they interviewed a guy from ASU, and he was talking about some new high-tech satellite-based method for detecting changes in groundwater based on, if you got a bunch of groundwater under the ground, the gravity pulls so much, and if that's depleted, then it pulls less. And it would seem like in the rural part of the state, this could offer just a vast improvement in the accuracy in which you'd assess, what was going on groundwater wise in various basins where you didn't have the data you'd find in active management areas. Can you comment on this?
A little bit. So I'm not sure if I am thinking of exactly what was on horizon or not, but there are a couple new technologies out there with gravity type data that is actually detected from satellites. It's really fascinating. I'm a big nerd and I really like that kind of stuff. It's really interesting. And there's also additional technologies related to evapotranspiration tools like OpenET that are available to create estimates around how much water plants are taking up or transpiring. We are constantly evaluating those types of tools. We have collaboration with ASU. We have collaboration with a researcher in Colorado that are looking into a lot of these types of things and working on developing tools and really wanting to make sure that they're developing things that might be relevant for the analysts on the supply and demand team or for policymakers within ADWR. In terms of their actual practicality, we've struggled a little bit in terms of seeing good correlations to fine scale water use estimates. And what I mean by that is when our hydrology team is making a groundwater flow model, for example, that type of information doesn't necessarily provide enough granular level data that they are able to distinguish flow patterns or cones of depression or those types of things within a groundwater basin. They might create pretty good broad scale estimates at the basin level, but it's harder to understand those kind of finer scale things where you might see variation within a basin. We're certainly evaluating those things going forward. There's a lot of advancements happening right now, which is really exciting. So it's definitely something we're tracking and looking into over time, but we just haven't seen much in terms of actual practical results there yet.
Thank you.
I saw that same program was super interesting. Let's see. It says, Tim, this will be the last one. Last question.
It's actually Kate Cossey.
Okay.
Because either in the conservation plans or with the Water Policy Council, have they looked at requiring new construction to meet water smart construction standards, which I understand can save 30% of the water for that building going forward? Either by adding to the assured water supply, presuming that a building is going to use 30% less, or some way to get the builders incentivized to use water smart construction.
Sure. So individual builders can, as they're applying for things like assured water supply, can say we're requiring these water smart fixtures and that kind of thing in each of these builds. And by requiring that in each of the builds, they can request a change to how those water use estimates are calculated. So there might be developers who are doing that kind of on a voluntary basis. I don't think that I've seen anything in this kind of round of discussions that has specifically brought that forth. But what we really do see is that there's pretty broad adoption of that on a voluntary basis.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalie. Again, excellent presentation, and appreciate you going a little over. I know it's been a long day for you, and going a little over and answering all of our questions. Again, if everyone can give Natalie a hand, you can use your virtual clapping under reactions, or if you feel so inclined, you can use the little other emojis. But anyway, thanks so much, Natalie, and we appreciate you sending the slides and everything, and I will get those out to folks. And then just wanted to let folks know we will be doing another program next week on democracy. So hopefully you can join for that.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Night.